As we begin, let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask you to send your blessings, your care, and your support to the people in California who are fighting the fires. We ask your particular protection for people who are hiking and may not even realize the danger that's around them. We ask this in the name of Jesus the Lord. So, at the period in which we're talking about now, the Balkan lands are actually under Turkish control. The Ottoman Empire was massive. And while the Christians were tolerated, Christians were not allowed any public expression. So you could practice your faith, but you had to do it privately and this sort of thing. The survival of the Catholic Church in this area is actually the work of Franciscan missionaries who went into the area and lived there teaching the people. They would live among the people, they would have jobs, and then they would teach the people in their homes and this sort of thing. But they kept the faith going in that area. In the early 7th century, there was a powerful revival of the Catholic Church in this area. And in time, the area came to be under the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were in Austria. And when it came under the Habsburgs, the church began to build churches and create a strong, visible presence. But what had happened was, during this time of kind of persecution, they were not allowed to be public in their faith, but they weren't being killed or anything. And during this time, what went on is the church became stronger and stronger. The really interesting thing is to watch historically how persecution affects the church. I've never ever seen a book on it, but it'd be a wonderful thing for something like a PhD thesis or something in history. But if you watch a country like Cuba, because I watched that happen in my lifetime, Cuba was probably 99.9% Catholic when the persecutions began under Castro. And as the period went on, we had this 99.9% Catholics. About 8% attended church. Very common oftentimes in Hispanic countries where the faith is just presumed to be Catholic. No one would be anything else, but they weren't really involved. And as the Castro regime became more and more strong in their persecution, the Catholic Church dropped, as it is today, probably to about 35% of the population. However, that 35% go to church. So when you look at it, it looks as though it could be a plus rather than a minus. Persecution oftentimes seems to strengthen the church. Now in 1623, we have a man that you're familiar with from history, which is Blaise Pascal. He was a prodigy, but in the areas of mathematics and science, and he stands as one of the great scientists of the 17th century, of the 16th century rather, along with Newton and Leibniz. This was a time in which science was really taking off. The period we're looking at now for probably several weeks will transform the world that we know from the 1600s, will transform it into the world that you and I know today. But the first of the transformation begins with science. Now, Blaise Pascal taught science and the scientific method that are not the whole of life. So he's a great scientist, but he teaches the scientific method and all this thing about science. That isn't all there is to life, okay? He says there are things that are beyond reason, the things of faith. He had a very close call with death at one time and had a night that he describes as a night of fire. He said that his mind, his heart, and soul were suddenly changed with the realization of the reality of Jesus Christ. So he was never a non-religious man, but he did not have this fire. One night, this thing that it's all real just hit him. And I think I've told you that in my own life, with regards to scripture and stuff, that hit me the first time I visited the Holy Land. that the more you go over the Holy Land and think of the life of Jesus in the context and stuff, so many things that don't make sense in the scriptures, suddenly you realize they're all logical. That's the way it works. That's the way it has to work. And the truth of it just sort of, it hits you like a rock, okay? The message of God became for him the most important thing in the world. In the clear words of a scientist, he wrote a book, it's called The Thoughts, in which he never finished. He died at the age of 39. He never finished the book, The Thoughts, but his book, The Thoughts, is about religion, but it's in terms and clarity that you would expect from a scientist. It's really an amazing work, as much of it as exists. In France, Louis XIV took away all the rights of the French Calvinists. Now, the Calvinists in France were called the Huguenots. And at the same time, he made himself head of the French church, the Catholic Church. So he made himself head of the church and then attacked the people who did not, members of the same thing. He believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that the authority of the king comes directly from God and not from the people. See, that's a radical change from what you and I think. We think the power of anyone to rule comes from the people. If I would take, for instance, the Queen of England, who is certainly a monarch, certainly with a series of family involvement in royalty and all this sort of stuff, but no one thinks that she rules independently of the people. And if when the whole business was going on with Diane Spencer and the things that were going on with regards to royalty and stuff, there was a real discussion in England as to whether that could destroy the monarchy. Well, if the monarchy is divine, then it can't be destroyed. But we don't see civil power that way, no matter how they come by it, okay? So he wanted the religious people of France to be of one religion. He exiled all the Huguenot ministers, and lay people were imprisoned or sent to work as galley slaves on French ships. So he basically smudged out the Huguenots that were in France. He also did not want the influence of the Pope in Italy to have any power in France, okay? Now, it's curious that he's doing the same thing in France that Henry VIII would do in England, okay? Exactly the same thing. At almost the same time in France, there began a movement called Quietism, mainly because the people thought that the movement made people very passive, okay? So it was called Quietism because it was a movement that centered on listening to God and spirituality. If you and I were to see a group of people who in that time like were Quietists, you and I would think today they're Buddhists. They would look to us like Zen Buddhists, okay? It was a form of thinking that taught that inner peace was found in the complete surrender of oneself to the hands of God. We believe that. We believe that peace in human life and confidence, everything, comes from this idea of personal surrender to God himself. A huge dispute between two bishops arose over this whole issue, and Quietism was condemned. One of the reasons is Quietism came into the church, and as it came into the church, we've discussed this a little earlier, as it came into the church, people stopped being involved in services and stuff, saw their religion much more as a God and me thing, okay? They did not seem to understand that when one surrenders to God, then that involves people. So if I surrender, we believe that if you surrender yourself to God, if you surrender yourself to Jesus Christ, what's the first thing he's going to say is love your neighbor, forgive your neighbor. You cannot have this independently of a community. At the end of the 17th century, Europe finally accepted the religious divisions, and an uneasy but lasting peace settled over all the nations. Now remember, at this time, most nations are of one faith. Like you can see that in France. They got rid of the Huguenots and this sort of thing. But most nations were of one faith. Protestants seemed at this time to begin to go through the endless divisions that we know now today of so many different denominations. And the big thing that started probably about 35 years ago, but has become massive today, is people whose church is not a member of any denomination, but is founded by a particular minister, and when the minister dies, it dissolves. And there are many, many churches like this. Probably the one in California that would be example was the one Schuller founded, which was a Crystal Cathedral. And a huge, huge following all over the world of people who supported him. He sent out missionaries, everything. And as he got older and could not be involved in it, and others took over, it just evolved down. It just disappeared. But he actually was a Methodist. But I mean, he wasn't involved with the Methodist Church or anything as the thing went on. Luther was central to all the Protestants as they broke off. They all retained a general thing of Luther. One of the things about Luther is that when he broke from the church at the beginning, for instance, he wrote books on Mariology. He believed in the Eucharist and all this sort of thing. And when he was excommunicated and the church really moved against him, he began to get very angry and wrote books like against the Eucharist, against papal authority, against all these things, I think largely to anger the Pope. But as a result of that, if you are a person who believes in the Eucharist, you can be very comfortable accepting Luther because he has books on the Eucharist. If you're a person who rejects the Eucharist as the body and blood of Christ, you can be very comfortable relying on Luther because there are books where he denies it. And he'll go through this spectrum. So these different Protestant groups can all look to Luther, but they're at different stages of Luther's life. Catholics at this time began to develop much more devotional lives. And I would say, like when I was a youngster, probably we're seeing the quite a what do you call it? One of the things Vatican II did was emphasize more of this what do you call it? Social service and action and stuff as distinct from devotions. So like if you were to take a group in the parish here, when I was a youngster, groups in the parish would have benediction different nights, in the church, and that was their big devotion. Today, if you have groups in those parish, they're very likely to go out and serve food at a homeless shelter as a group. They're very likely to go out and do stuff like that. But that's a change of Vatican II. Vatican II sees us much more involved in this social expression of the gospel. In 1650, the Christian view of Europe began to change. Humanists remained Christian, but their views were not those of the earliest Christians. Okay? So again, remember that humanism causes us to see the value of the individual. We watch, if you go way back, what you see is the value of the tribe. And people would sacrifice themselves for the tribe. That evolves into the nation, in which soldiers and stuff still sacrifice themselves for the nation. But it will evolve from that into humanism, where the importance of the individual is there. Now, collectively, some of us have to sacrifice ourselves to preserve the nation. But even those who do sacrifice themselves, we remember them with great honor and everything, because as individuals, they're valuable. Everyone is valuable as an individual. Protestants had put an end to any idea that there was one day a religiously united Europe. But at the same time, explorers were discovering brand new lands. Scientists were finding new ways to view the universe. Rulers were organizing their states in different ways. And businesses were finding new ways to ship and sell goods. So commerce grows, governments change. There's a period of very great change. Most people continued in their faith, but many claimed that nature and natural law were more important. Natural law and this was a big thing in Thomas Aquinas, natural law is the belief that there is what do I want to call it? Laws that are intrinsic to nature itself. And natural law, as an example, would be, the whole birth control teaching in the Catholic Church, for instance. The idea is sexuality is determined by God basically for the production of children. So to engage in sexuality in such a way that the birth of a child is impossible was seen as wrong. Now, what does that condemn? A condemnation of masturbation. It's a condemnation of condoms. It's a condemnation of birth control pills. Anything that would be basically sexual and not geared to the birth of children. Today, when we look at this, and I'll speak of it not in sexuality, but let me speak of it in marriage. When I entered the seminary, we were taught the primary purpose of marriage was children. And, you could well argue that that's true. But it's amazing the number of people who cannot have children who enter into marriage. And by that, I don't just mean people with physical problems. I'm thinking of older retired people where the husband of one dies, the wife of the other dies, and they form a couple, they marry. And we began to see, probably maybe a little while before Vatican II, we began to notice that in most people's minds, the primary purpose of marriage is a relationship between the husband and wife. And now, when we talk about marriage, like when I was in the seminary, the purpose of marriage is children. We watched that evolve to the purpose of marriage is children and the mutual building of the spouse. And then it became the purpose of marriage is the mutual building of the spouse and children. Okay, now that's where it sits today. But natural law is built on the purpose of different things. But science, over a period of time, will discover that the purpose of something is different than it may appear to be to us in the first place. And so natural law came under suspicion much later, but at this time it's beginning. Natural law is coming on the scene. And theologians are very, 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 very into this idea of natural laws. People like Copernicus and Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, and Newton, they formed a new picture of the world. They began to look at the world in very, very different ways, in the ways the stars moved, our relationship to other planets, our relationship to one another. They began to change the worldview, and knowledge appeared to be power. There was a growing confidence in the power of human reason without revelation. Now, that's what humanism is. Humanism is often called Christianity without Jesus. Okay? But I'll give you an example. We have from Jesus Christ the simple teaching that you and I must love one another. We have from human experience, life works best with the people we love. It does not work well with the people we don't like. Okay? We have from the teachings of Jesus, we must forgive people and not be vengeful. Our experience of human life is that society goes better if we forgive people than if we try and be vengeful. So I believe a lot of what Jesus was telling us is telling us how human life works. And he tells us that in Revelation. Science is discovering much of what Jesus told us, in fact, is true. Sociology is discovering it isn't just nice to be forgiving, it works. Okay? So in these sciences, we see a different approach to the same thing. Now, One of the things that's held, I would cite St. Augustine on this, but one of the things that's held is that there are many paths to the truth. The truth is Jesus. But there are many paths. There's a scientific path, there's an experiential path, there's an emotional path, there's a biblical path. There are lots of paths to Jesus. But in the end, there's only one truth, and he is it. Okay? Some believing at this point that religion was simply superstition, and not only that, but religion needed to be eradicated because they saw religion or faith at odds with knowledge. So if you want people to have knowledge and know things, you have to get rid of religion. And so that became one of the evolutions of this movement. These views began to come together into a movement known as the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. Okay, they saw it as reason and enlightenment began to dominate over religion. There were two main ideas based on this emphasis on logical thinking. They were the freedom of inquiry and the freedom of decision-making. Okay? So if things are based on knowledge, the thing you have to do is have the freedom to study all these different things. Now, I think you know the Catholic Church historically has had a list of forbidden books. They said, well, you can't really have forbidden books if you want to have freedom of knowledge. And people should have the freedom to read and study and all that sort of thing. And you know, that has become a big part of our society. And at the same time, there's a conflict within it. You know, that, for instance, we all know that literature and everything should be open to all people. At the same time, we guard our children against pornography. Okay, it's just, and so this idea that there must be absolute freedom is one position. The other idea is the control of knowledge. And these two things are kind of at odds. Now, I think you know our tradition is the freedom tradition in the United States. It's basically the thing we hold, that we believe if people see the different views and evaluate them, they will arrive at the right one, okay? This movement would take many different forms in different places during a very long and slow process. But once it was done, Europe would be changed completely. Okay, now this began with the Reformation. If you looked at Europe in the days of Constantine or something like that, you saw that Europe was united by the Christian faith. That was the point of union. And when the Christian faith ceased to be united, there had to be a whole new view that went, and now we're seeing the beginning of that, okay? It's going to take a long time to flower into what's going on today. And I think today we're still part of the process of that change. I don't think it's completed yet. The 1700s saw a great increase in travel, and the published reports from these travels made Europeans aware of the world like never before. You know, I remember when I was a little boy, my grandparents in Canada gave me, for a Christmas present, a subscription to the National Geographic. And I remember vividly the very first issue I got. The first issue I got, the focus, or the main story in the issue, was about the barrier reef in Australia. And they showed animals I'd never seen before, and it really blew my mind. Now, I'm a person who's very interested in nature. I've studied a lot about rocks and plants and animals and insects and that sort of thing, but I tended to do it where I had access to those insects. And like if I were to take something like a praying mantis, there are over 1,000 varieties of praying mantis. And some of them have been, I know 2 of them were discovered within the last 4 years. They were discovered in South America, and they are so designed that they can sit on a stem and they look like an orchid. So scientists passed them in the forest and everything, and no one ever quite caught on that it was a praying mantis. But this idea, they became more and more aware of the world. They became aware of the fact there were different religions, not just varieties of Christianity, but different religions, and deeply committed people in those religions, who sometimes with a tradition more ancient than our own. And so it really caught them. Europeans believed that their religion and culture were superior to any other, and now they discover a huge variety of cultures and religions, and we're no longer sure. And we'll watch, in the United States, we had a back to nature movement. We get these movements periodically where, and incidentally, the most recent is the hippie movement. But the back to nature movement says that, we know too much, we're involved in all this kind of thing. We have to get back and just live natural lives. We should be able to relate to one another without marriage. We should be able to, all this sort of thing. And it comes out. But one of the things that's born from that is they'll look at a culture like Japan. This is something that still strikes me. I was in Japan for a month last year, and I have never seen any people so polite. And I've never seen any people so honest. Like if there were, a friend of mine and I went into the hot tubs in one of the hotels we were in, and we're in a different country, we're doing different things and stuff, and so you tend to be very forgetful. When we were in the hot tub, both of us took off our glasses, largely because they fog up there. And it was interesting, when we were leaving, someone came over, picked up the two glasses, and knew which belonged to each person, and handed them to us. At one point, another time in Japan, a friend of mine, we got back to the hotel, and my friend had left his camera at the bench where we were waiting for the bus. And we'd visited a temple, and when we got to the hotel, we were just really upset about the whole thing. And we mentioned it to the young lady as we were going up to our room. The lady at the desk asked us what was going on, and we told her. She says, "Go back tomorrow and get it. No one's going to become a thief for a camera." We went back the next day, it was sitting there. It's just, and you look at, how can they be so honest? They are not Christian. They have no real religion in Japan. The people are irreligious. So if their ancient religion is Shinto, the sort of modern one is Buddhist, and this sort of thing. But if you watch Japan, the ceremonies around someone who's born and everything are Shinto ceremonies. But they aren't part of the Shinto religion, but they're Shinto ceremonies. I'll give you another example. When they're married, it's a Christian ceremony. They really like Christian weddings. They're much more elaborate. So you'll have Christian weddings. And they have certain Buddhist ceremonies that take place as part of their life. And these ceremonies or feasts during the year for the different religions, everyone celebrates them. So it doesn't matter whether you're a Buddhist, you celebrate the Shinto feast too. It doesn't matter if you're Shinto, you celebrate Christmas. Everyone celebrates all of these. And they're very, very, very honest, a good culture. Missionaries began to realize the importance of different cultures and grew in respect and understanding of these cultures. See, when we look at these cultures from the United States, and have no experience of the culture, it's really hard for us to realize the power and value of an individual culture. But again, if you go into China, in a very ancient culture, you look at the buildings they produced, you look at the art they produced, you look at all these things, and you realize this is a very powerful, a very, very highly developed culture, and totally different from ours. And so you begin to realize that there's valid cultures that aren't what we have. And missionaries are the ones that notice this. Many very sophisticated cultures, like those in Asia, prospered with great morality, great organization, everything, and they did it all without Christianity. Now you have to admit, in the West, Christianity made that. Christianity was the thing that developed that as a culture here, but it developed in other lands without Christianity. Okay? There was a priest, and I don't know if I can pronounce this, but it's Lafitu. He's a Jesuit. And he brought to Europe examples of the art and the cultures of the Native Americans, and then published a book about the Iroquois and Huron, suggesting that they had some basic notions about divine revelation. When the missionaries came to the Native Americans, they were surprised at the importance of religion. Like there was an explorer, one of the big explorers. I think he was part of that expedition that came clear across the United States and finally reached the Pacific Ocean. It was sent by the government. And one of the things he said when he was discussing Native Americans, he said there's only one absolute necessity in the daily life of the American native, and that is prayer. They all pray. It's a very, very strong thing in Native American culture, the relationship that the individual has from God. And they began to notice certain things, like just in the community, my family's from the Assiniboine. The Assiniboine, we were always taught that there was a creator who created everything. And when we spoke to the creator, we always spoke through the firstborn. I want you to know the creator had no gender, the firstborn had no gender. But we were always taught we prayed through the firstborn to the creator. We didn't know anything about the firstborn or anything like that. When the missionaries came, what my grandmother told me is the missionaries gave us the names. The missionaries told us the creator wanted us to call him Father. And the firstborn was Jesus Christ. And a spirit existed between the two. But when they came to our community, they found we already worshiped a creator and a firstborn. And so the missionaries were really struck not only about the religion, but the theology behind it in the Native Americans. And this had all taken place without the Bible. For many people, this was the first time they had ever discovered Native people who they did not regard as atheists. It's one of the good things that when the missionaries came in to the Americas, they did not regard the Native Americans as atheists. And the reason I mention this is when they went into China, they regarded them as atheists. When they went into Africa, they regarded them as atheists. And they weren't atheists. They all have their own, kind of worship stuff. So the doctrine of Jansenism was rising again in France. We talked about Jansenism. The one facet of this doctrine was that God created some people to be saved and some people to be damned. Okay, so at the time of creation, God knows whether you're saved or lost, but God could not possibly create someone to be lost. Jansenism and Calvin teaches that God creates people to be saved and to be lost. He knows that beginning. So in 1713, Pope Clement XI condemned Jansenism, but the decree was not received well in France. France has a very interesting relationship with the church when you study it historically. The French people will all claim to be Catholic, and they're all very involved with the church and that sort of stuff, but they're always suspicious of clerics. And the higher you get in clericalism, the more they're suspicious. They're suspicious of priests. They're more suspicious of bishops, most suspicious of the Pope. And so when the Pope came down on this, they were not pleased in France. Jansen, as I mentioned, that was all over France. Some theologians that the thought the decree condemned St. Augustine's teachings as well, and the French church became seriously divided about this. One of the things to understand about theology, when a person writes theology, they will write a lot of theology on all different kinds of things. And when you read the theology, you need to understand when it was written. There was a wonderful program, forget even the name of it now, but what they did was get together a group of actors, good actors, and they would have each one of the actors study the life and teachings of some person and then be in a panel discussion. And let's say they have a panel discussion on government. They would have someone like Nero, they would have George Washington, Louis XIV of France, they discuss government. Fascinating. They did one on religion that was really amazing. But in it was St. Augustine, in it was Martin Luther, and several others. Thomas More was in it. I forget. But anyway, there were several others. The thing I most remember is the conflict between Luther and Augustine. Because when Luther and Augustine were arguing, finally Luther stood up and he said, "I said nothing other than what you said, and you were canonized, and I was excommunicated." And you begin to study the theology, and it's pretty close to true. St. Augustine saw all salvation coming from grace, and this grace bestowed by God, and this sort of thing. But St. Augustine never examined the question of, does God give that grace to everyone? Calvin did, and Luther did. And so they saw it in a very different way. But to say they were different from Augustine, they really weren't. It's just that Augustine did not look at the consequences of some of the things. Had he seen the consequences, he'd seen it as wrong. Another one, Thomas Aquinas, denied the Immaculate Conception. But he denied that long before the Immaculate Conception was a doctrine. But anyway, these things began to have great trouble. So France, anyway, is seriously divided. Louis XIV, King Louis, decided for the acceptance of the decree for the French church, but it was not well received. Okay, so he just decides. Louis XIV believed he had the right to decide which of the papal decrees would actually be published in France and which wouldn't. When Louis XIV died, his successor, Louis XV, was a supporter of Jansenism, and he allowed bishops and priests to ignore the decrees of Louis XIV. Angry debate was carried on in printed publications. Finally, the king took a stronger position and silenced both sides of the issue. He simply said, this cannot be discussed, okay? And because there seemed to be no resolution to it. I think I've mentioned to you before that there's something like that in the Catholic Church. And it has to do with how does God's omnipotence, all-powerfulness, work with human free will? How could God be all-powerful if I make a decision against him? Okay? How does God know what I'm going to do without causing it to happen? And there seems to be no resolution to it. There are lots and lots of arguments about it. But every time you come down on one side or another, you find you have problems. So, new religious developments were seen in various countries in Europe. So now we talked about the breakup of the Protestant churches. Now here are some examples. The Quakers were organized by George Fox and believed in an ongoing revelation in addition to the Bible. Okay? See, now we hold that in the Catholic Church. We hold that God reveals his truths to us through the teaching of a church itself over a period of time. And like, for instance, if you would see the creed originally in the church, it was very short. But very early in the church is the Apostles' Creed. Doesn't date from the Apostles, but very early. And so the Apostles' Creed is the one we're all kind of used to. We know that. But you know, the creed that was published at Vatican II, I think, is 3 pages. And so each time we have a counselor, we more define and develop our beliefs. So we have an ongoing revelation. And George Fox believed this. The way the Quakers are described, they had their meetings. And when you would go to a Quaker meeting, everyone sits and you sit in absolute silence until some person is convinced that God has given them a revelation. Then they stand up and speak it and sit down. And we think about it and this sort of thing. If someone else has a revelation, they get up and speak it. And they were called Quakers because many of them would start shaking or quaking before they would stand up to give their revelation. They met in unadorned rooms in silence until one person felt that there was a revelation from the Lord and they shared it. The community never had any ordained clergy. There were never clergy to the group. The elders, like you'd say, who leads the meeting and everything, the meeting is organized and set up usually by 2 or 3 of the older members of the community. But it's not, they aren't clergy or they aren't technically in charge. They refused to take their hats off in the presence of kings or judges. There are little things about religions that, you know, become fascinating. You look at the Jehovah's Witnesses who refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance, or groups that refuse to sing the national anthem, or, you know, they can be different. But to me, these are quirks of religion. So they refused to take their hats off in the presence of judges and kings because they wanted to be obvious when they took their hat off in the presence of God, it meant something. And that's why, like, as an example, if you buy Quaker Oats, you notice the guy on the cover is wearing his hat, okay? The Quakers were normally pictured with their hats. They refused to take an oath because to do so testified to the fact a person was in the habit of lying. And if guided by their inner light, they would not take part in wars or military service. So they were pacifist, and they would not take oaths, not take their hands off. The idea is the only person who takes an oath tells you that now what I'm about to say is the truth. They're saying that they normally lie. That's why I have to take an oath. I normally lie, but right here I'm telling you the truth so that it's over. And so not to take an oath should be a testimony that I never lie. And incidentally, in court, if you don't want to take an oath, all you have to do is say you agree to the penalty of perjury if you are lying, because that's the reason you take the oath, so that you can be prosecuted if in fact you lie. So they didn't have military service. They were greatly persecuted, and they suffered terribly in England, which is one of the reasons they came to the New World. But the Quakers suffered really badly. I think you know that it's very troubling to a government to have people refuse to serve in the military for religious reasons. And the reason is, if you have a really strong commitment to God that prohibits your going in the military, and you can stand on that, then maybe I'm just a coward, so I decide to stand on your religion so that I don't have to go to a war. And so it was really, the governments, greatly persecuted them. We have great examples in the United States of Catholics, the Berrigan brothers and Dorothy Day and stuff like that. Lots of Catholics who were very strong pacifists, although pacifism is not the teaching of the church. They were very strong pacifists, and largely because they didn't like the nature of the wars. Like, for instance, the Berrigan brothers, it was for Vietnam. They thought it was an immoral war. They weren't against going to war, period, but they were against the immoral war. But it's just a very difficult thing for government to live with. One of their members, a man by the name of William Penn, established an American colony in 1682. It's named after him. It's called Pennsylvania. It was the very first place in the United States where there was absolute freedom of religion for anyone. So anyone could go in there. So like we had Catholic settlements in which if you were a Protestant, you wouldn't be too comfortable. And we had Protestant settlements where if you were a Catholic, you wouldn't be too comfortable. Oftentimes, people from that situation would go to Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, these communities that were formed by William Penn, the communities had absolute religious tolerance. And it's because they had suffered so much in England under persecution. It's interesting when you see the founding and the beginning of the United States, the huge percentage of people who came over because they were suffering religious persecution. That's one of the reasons why I think we have freedom of religion in the United States. We are made up of groups of people who suffered themselves persecution and now didn't want to see that at all when they came. Okay, we'll call it there and pick it up there next week. Thank you very much for your attention.